The ghost of a 12-hour shift clung to Sarah Jenkins like a shroud. It was a familiar specter, woven from the threads of antiseptic, sterile latex, and the faint, metallic tang of blood that never quite washed away. At 32, she wore her ER nursing scrubs like a second skin, a uniform that separated her from the normal rhythms of the world. Tonight, or rather this morning, as the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky bled into the horizon, she was driving toward freedom. Her 2008 Honda Civic, affectionately named the Mule for its stubborn reliability, was packed to the gills with camping gear. Tent, sleeping bags, a cooler full of beer and sandwiches, and the promise of 2 glorious days disconnected from the relentless beeping of heart monitors and the symphony of human suffering. "Are you sure you packed the extra-long marshmallow skewers?" The voice of her younger sister, Jessie, crackled through the car's Bluetooth, a beacon of levity in the quiet hum of the engine. "Because I refuse to have a repeat of last year's incident. I'm still finding singed sugar in my hair." Sarah laughed, a genuine throaty sound that felt foreign after a night of clipped professional pronouncements. "The great marshmallow catastrophe of 24 will not be repeated. I bought skewers that could double as jousting lances. Sir Reginald Fluffington will be toasted with honor and dignity this year." "Good. And the bug spray? The kind that could fell a moose? Because those mosquitoes last time were flying in military formation." "Check. And I even remembered your weird herbal tea that smells like lawn clippings." "It's for centering oneself in nature, you heathen," Jessie retorted, though Sarah could hear the smile in her voice. The call was a ritual, their pre-trip checklist that was less about logistics and more about stoking the shared fire of anticipation. This trip was medicine. The ER had been a pressure cooker lately, a relentless tide of trauma and heartbreak. Just yesterday, she'd spent 3 hours trying to save a teenager from a motorcycle accident, only to have to face his parents with the worst news of their lives. The weight of that conversation still sat heavy in her chest. She needed the cleansing scent of pine and the simple, honest fatigue of a long hike. Her thoughts were interrupted by a flicker of red and blue light reflecting in her rearview mirror. Then another, and another. As she crested a small hill on the residential back road she used as a shortcut, the idyllic suburban tranquility shattered. Ahead, a 2-story colonial home was being consumed by a furious, roaring inferno. Orange flames, greedy and alive, punched through the roof, sending a geyser of sparks into the lightening sky. A thick, acrid plume of black smoke billowed upwards, a toxic stain against the delicate pastels of dawn. Fire trucks angled across the street, their lights painting the scene in frantic, strobing flashes. "Jessie, hold on a sec," Sarah murmured, her voice tight. "Something's going on up ahead." "Everything okay?" Jessie's playful tone vanished, replaced by a sharp edge of concern. "Did you finally run out of gas halfway to the campsite?" Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "No, nothing like that. Looks like a bad house fire." And then she saw him. Through the shifting curtains of smoke and steam, a figure in full turnout gear staggered out of the house's front door. He was a silhouette against the blaze, moving with a jerky, uncoordinated gait. He took 3, maybe 4, faltering steps onto the perfectly manicured lawn before his legs gave out. He didn't fall so much as crumple, a puppet with its strings snipped, collapsing in a heap of heavy fabric and gear. Even from 50 yards away, Sarah could see the dark stain, blossoming on the thigh of his thick, protective pants. It was spreading with an alarming speed that screamed one thing: arterial bleed. "Jessie, I gotta go," Sarah said, the words clipped, the ER nurse taking over in a flash of pure, unadulterated instinct. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of cold, clear adrenaline. "Someone's hurt." She didn't wait for a reply. The phone clattered into the passenger seat as she wrenched the wheel, pulling the mule to a sharp halt at the curb, heedless of the manicured flower beds. The camping gear in the back shifted with a heavy thud as she vaulted out of the driver's side door. Her mind was a high-speed checklist. Scene safety? Relatively. Away from the main structure. Number of victims? 1 visible, critical. My resources? She wrenched open the trunk. Past the tent and the cooler, nestled in a corner, was a heavy-duty nylon bag. Her "oh crap" kit. It was an advanced trauma bag she'd assembled herself over the years, far more comprehensive than any store-bought version. Tourniquets, Israeli bandages, chest seals, trauma shears, hemostatic gauze. It was overkill for a camping trip, but for a nurse who'd seen the universe's cruel and sudden whims, it was just common sense. Slamming the trunk, she broke into a dead sprint, the heavy bag bumping against her hip. The air grew thick and hot, smelling of burning plastic, scorched wood, and something else. A sharp chemical tang like gasoline that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The roar of the fire was a physical presence, a deep, guttural sound punctuated by the sharp crackle of timbers giving way, and the hoarse shouts of the firefighters. They were focused on the house, a desperate, coordinated ballet of men and water aimed at the heart of the blaze. The injured man on the lawn was on the periphery of the chaos, a secondary concern to the immediate threat of the fire spreading to the neighboring homes. He was alone. As Sarah closed the distance, a man stumbled into her path. He was portly, in his late 50s, his expensive silk pajamas singed at the cuffs and his face a mask of soot and frantic desperation. "My antiques! My mother's jewelry!" he shrieked, his voice shrill with panic. He grabbed the arm of a passing firefighter, who shook him off with a brusque, "Sir, we're working on it. Please stay back." This was Mr. Abernathy, the homeowner, a man so consumed by the loss of his possessions that he was utterly blind to the life bleeding out onto his prize-winning Kentucky bluegrass. He saw Sarah approaching, her determined face and medical bag a new target for his hysteria. You have to help!" he cried, blocking her way. "Everything I own is in there. My collection of 18th century porcelain birds." Sarah's mind, usually a fortress of professional calm, recoiled in disbelief. "Sir, there's a man bleeding to death right there," she said, her voice sharp, trying to push past him. The callousness, the sheer breathtaking selfishness of it, was infuriating. "But the birds are irreplaceable," he insisted, his hands flapping ineffectually. He physically stood in her way, his body a soft, doughy barrier between her and her patient. "So is a human life," Sarah snapped, shoving past him with a force that surprised them both. She didn't have time for this. She heard him sputtering behind her, his indignation lost in the greater roar of the emergency. She dropped to her knees in the damp grass beside the firefighter. His helmet had rolled a few feet away, revealing a strong jawline and a shock of sweat-soaked brown hair under the grime. His eyes were closed, his face pale and clammy beneath the soot. The name tape on his coat read, Sullivan. "Sullivan? Can you hear me?" she said loudly and clearly, her hands already at work. His breathing was shallow, his pulse thready and fast under her fingers. She didn't need a blood pressure cuff to know he was in hemorrhagic shock. She took the heavy trauma shears from her bag and began cutting through the thick, reinforced fabric of his bunker pants. The material was tough, designed to withstand fire and tearing, and she had to put her back into it. As she sliced it open, the source of the bleeding was revealed, and a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. A jagged piece of metal, shrapnel, maybe from an explosion, was embedded deep in his upper thigh, right over the femoral artery. The blood wasn't just flowing, it was pulsing, a sickening rhythmic pump of life spilling onto the grass. He had minutes, maybe less. "Okay, Sullivan, I'm a nurse. I'm going to help you," she said, her voice a steady, calming mantra for both of them. From the corner of her eye, she registered movement. A figure detaching itself from the shadows near a large oak tree at the edge of the property, away from the main chaos. He was young, maybe early 20s, rail-thin and twitchy. His clothes were dark and ragged, his eyes wide and vacant with a chemical sheen. He watched the scene with a strange, proprietary intensity, a predator observing its handiwork. This was Trevor, Mr. Abernathy's son, the unseen architect of this destruction, his mind a toxic cocktail of methamphetamines and long-simmering resentment. Sarah paid him no mind. Her world had narrowed to the wound, to the race against time. She ripped open a package of hemostatic gauze designed to clot blood on contact, and prepared to pack the wound. "This is going to hurt," she warned the unconscious firefighter. But as she leaned in, her focus absolute, Trevor began to move. He lurched forward, his steps unsteady but quick. In his paranoid, drug-fueled reality, the scene was a tableau of his enemies. The firefighters, his father, and now this woman in scrubs. Another authority figure, another part of the system he despised, tending to the very people he'd hoped to see suffer. She was fixing what he had broken. He closed the 10-yard gap in seconds. Sarah only looked up when his shadow fell over her. She saw the wildness in his eyes, the flash of something metallic in his hand. It wasn't the glint of a tool or a piece of debris. It was a knife. A cheap, serrated kitchen knife gripped in a white-knuckled fist. There was no time to scream, no time to react. A searing electric pain exploded in her back, just below her shoulder blade. It was a blinding, breathtaking agony that stole the air from her lungs. She gasped, a wet, choked sound. Then it came again, lower down, a vicious, tearing sensation. And a third time, a fourth, each stab a fresh nova of torment. The force of the repeated blows threw her forward, her body slumping over Sully's legs. Her vision swam, the vibrant colors of the fire and flashing lights dissolving into a blurry, distorted mess. Through the fog of pain, she was dimly aware of shouting. 2 other firefighters, having finally noticed the commotion, were charging across the lawn. They hit Trevor like a linebacker, a tangle of limbs and furious grunts as they slammed him to the ground. His enraged, nonsensical screams echoed as they fought to restrain him. Sarah tried to push herself up, a desperate, instinctual need to finish what she had started, to help Sully, but her arms wouldn't obey. A warm, sticky wetness was spreading across her back, soaking through her scrubs. She could feel her own lifeblood, warm and vital, draining away. The world began to tunnel, the roar of the fire and the shouts of the men fading into a dull, distant hum. Her last conscious thought was one of bitter, absurd irony. She'd run toward a fire to save a life, only to be extinguished by a shadow that emerged from the dark. The first thing to pierce the thick, opiate fog was the beeping. A steady, metronomic rhythm, impartial and insistent. It was the soundtrack of her professional life, the pulse of the ICU, but she had never been on this side of it. The sound was an anchor in a sea of disorientation. Next came the pain, a dull, omnipresent ache across her entire back and chest, punctuated by sharp, fiery jolts with every shallow breath. The sterile scent of the hospital was overwhelming, a concentrated version of the smell she usually carried home on her clothes. Sarah's eyes fluttered open. The world was a smear of white and pale green. A white ceiling with acoustic tiles, a pale green wall, the hazy outline of an IV pole with its dripping bags of fluid. She was in one of her own hospital's rooms, her own turf. Yet she felt like a complete stranger. Fragments of memory, sharp and jagged, began to surface. The heat, the blood, Sully, the firefighter. Had he made it? Her throat was raw, a tube having recently been removed. She tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. A nurse with kind eyes and a weary face bustled in, checking the monitors. Sully, Sarah rasped, the name a painful effort. The firefighter. Is he? The nurse smiled gently. Mark Sullivan is in stable condition down the hall. They took him into surgery right after you. The surgeon said the person who put that initial pressure on his leg saved his life. You saved his life, honey. Relief washed over Sarah, a wave so powerful it momentarily eclipsed her own pain. She had done it. In the chaos and the horror, she had succeeded. She closed her eyes, a small, pained smile touching her lips. The relief was short-lived. A few hours later, after she was more lucid, Dr. Evans made his rounds. He was a tall, imposing figure, the chief of surgery, with a reputation for brilliance and an ego to match. He carried himself with an air of untouchable authority, his crisp white coat like a suit of armor. He reviewed her chart without looking at her, his lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. "Miss Jenkins," he began, his voice devoid of warmth. "You have 8 stab wounds to your back and left shoulder. 1 punctured your left lung, which we had to reinflate. You had significant internal bleeding. You lost nearly 40% of your blood volume. You are, to put it mildly, extraordinarily lucky to be alive." Sarah nodded weakly. "Thank you, doctor, for—" He cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The medical team did its job, which is more than I can say for you." He finally looked at her, his eyes cold and clinical over his rimless glasses. Frankly, your actions were reckless and irresponsible. You are an ER nurse. You, of all people, should know the protocols. You do not enter an unsecured, active emergency scene. You wait for the trained and equipped first responders. That is their job. The words were like ice water, shocking and cruel. He was bleeding out, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. There wasn't time. Dr. Evans let out a sigh, the sound of a patient man explaining a simple concept to a difficult child. There are always procedures, Ms. Jenkins. Your impulsiveness not only put your own life at grave risk, but you could have become another victim for the firefighters to rescue, diverting critical resources from the primary emergency. You created a secondary crisis. You are a nurse, not a field medic, and certainly not a superhero. His lecture continued, a long, condescending monologue about protocol, liability, and the chain of command. Each word was a small, sharp jab, finding the tender spots in her psyche. He wasn't just treating her wounds. He was dissecting her character, judging her act of compassion as a foolish, egotistical mistake. It was infuriating. She had saved a man's life, and here was the chief of surgery dressing her down like a disobedient intern. Later that afternoon, the police arrived. Detective Miller was a rumpled, world-weary man in his 50s, with a coffee-stained tie and a cynical slump to his shoulders. He pulled a chair up to her bedside, his notebook open, his expression impassive. "Sarah Jenkins, I'm Detective Miller. I need to take your statement about the assault." Sarah, still reeling from Dr. Evans' verbal assault, braced herself. She recounted the events as clearly as she could, her voice gaining a little strength as she focused on the details. The fire, Mr. Abernathy's selfish panic, kneeling beside Sully, the sudden appearance of Trevor. Miller listened, his pen scratching across the page. His questions, when they came, were blunt and tinged with suspicion. "So you had no interaction with the suspect, Trevor Abernathy, prior to the attack?" "None. I didn't even see him until he was right on top of me." "And you're sure you didn't say anything to him? Nothing that could be misinterpreted as a threat?" Sarah stared at him, bewildered. "A threat? I was trying to save a man's life. I was talking to the firefighter." "Right," Miller said, making a note. "And why exactly did you feel the need to get involved? Your vehicle was a safe distance away. You could have just called 911 and reported an injured officer." It was the same infuriating refrain as Dr. Evans, the same clinical detachment, the same implicit blame. He was bleeding from his femoral artery. 911 was already there, but they were fighting a fire. He didn't have minutes, detective. He had seconds. I'm a nurse. I knew what I was seeing. "You're an ER nurse," Miller corrected, not unkindly, but with a maddening precision. "There's a difference. Did you consider that by leaving your vehicle and entering the scene, you made yourself a target?" It felt like an interrogation, not a victim interview. He was looking for angles, for mitigating factors, for a neat and tidy report that explained away the chaotic violence. Her heroism was an inconvenient, messy detail. The weight of his questions, of his doubt, was suffocating. The arrival of her family was a maelstrom of emotion. Her mother, Carol, burst into tears at the sight of her, her face a crumpled mask of fear and anguish. Her father, John, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant, stood stiffly by the door, his face a granite mask, but his clenched fists betrayed the storm raging within him. "Oh, Sarah, my baby!" Carol sobbed, clutching her hand. Her fear quickly curdled into recrimination. "Why? Why would you do something so dangerous? What were you thinking, running toward a fire like that? You have to think about your own safety." Her father finally spoke, his voice a low growl. "Who did this? What's his name?" Jesse, who had arrived with them, stepped in, playing peacemaker. "Mom, Dad, not now. She needs to rest." But Jessie was a warrior. She became Sarah's shield. When Dr. Evans came by on his evening rounds, Jessie stood up to him. "With all due respect, Doctor," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "my sister is a hero. Maybe you could focus on treating her injuries instead of critiquing her courage." Evans, unaccustomed to being challenged, simply grunted and left. When Detective Miller returned with follow-up questions, Jesse stood by the bed, her arms crossed, monitoring his every word, ready to shut him down if he stepped over the line. The story, however, was too potent to be contained within the hospital walls. A nurse stabbed while saving a firefighter from a fire set by the homeowner's own son. It was a perfect storm of heroism, tragedy, and local drama. It was catnip for the media. Brenda Vance, a reporter from a local news station with a reputation for sharp elbows and a flair for the dramatic, was the first to descend. She was relentless, camping out in the hospital lobby, pestering the nurses at their station, trying to get to Sarah. One afternoon, Jesse intercepted her in the hallway as she tried to sneak onto the ICU floor. "Can I help you?" Jesse asked, her voice deceptively sweet. "I'm Brenda Vance, Channel 8 News," the reporter said, flashing a press pass. "I'm here to speak with Sarah Jenkins. The public has a right to hear her story." "My sister is recovering from 8 stab wounds and a collapsed lung," Jessie said, her voice dropping, losing its sweetness and gaining a steely edge. "She's in no condition to speak to anyone, least of all someone who wants to splash her pain all over the evening news. So you can take your camera crew and your public's right to know and you can leave. Now." The confrontation, captured by another visitor on their phone, was a minor viral sensation in itself, a testament to Jessie's fierce loyalty. She was Sarah's protector, her press secretary, and her rock. But even Jessie couldn't shield her from the storm that was brewing outside the hospital walls. The world learned Sarah's name in a whirlwind of breaking news alerts and trending hashtags. Hashtag nurse hero. Haj angels in scrubs. The story spread from local news to national networks with breathtaking speed. She was on CNN, Fox News, mentioned in the opening monologues of late-night talk shows. Her face, a tired but smiling photo Jessie had provided from their last beach trip, was everywhere. Jessie's GoFundMe, initially set up with a modest goal of $10,000 to cover copays and lost wages, became a phenomenon. Donations poured in. $5 from a student in Ohio, $1,000 from a retired firefighter in California. The total climbed past $50,000, then $100,000, then $250,000. The messages attached were a deluge of pure, unadulterated support. "You represent the best of us, Sarah. Get well soon." From a fellow nurse, "Thank you for showing the world what we do." "My dad's a firefighter. You're a hero in our house." Sarah would read them with Jessie in the quiet hours of the night, tears streaming down her face. It was a powerful, humbling affirmation, a counter-narrative to the dismissive voices of Dr. Evans and Detective Miller. It was proof that people saw her, that they understood. But the internet is a place of dualities. For every wave of support, there is an undertow of venom. As her story grew, so did the backlash. Pundits on cable news, desperate for a contrarian take, began to question the narrative. "Are we celebrating recklessness?" one asked, his face a smug mask on the TV in her room. This nurse, while well-intentioned, disregarded every safety protocol. Then came the anonymous trolls, the faceless avatars who spewed their poison from the safety of their keyboards. The comments on news articles and social media posts were a cesspool of negativity. "She's an attention seeker, probably wanted to be famous." "Typical woman, letting emotions override common sense. Should have stayed in her car." "I bet she provoked the guy. There's always more to the story." "What about the attacker's rights? He's obviously a troubled young man, a victim of a broken system. Why is no one talking about his pain?" Reading those comments felt like being stabbed all over again, each word a small, poisoned dart finding its way through the armor of public goodwill. It was baffling, infuriating, and deeply wounding. How could anyone twist an act of selfless compassion into something ugly? In the midst of this public debate, a quiet, profound moment of clarity arrived in a wheelchair. Sully, his own leg in a heavy cast, insisted on being brought to her room. His face was still bruised, but his eyes were clear and full of a raw, overwhelming emotion. He wheeled himself to her bedside, his large, calloused firefighter's hands gently taking hers. I don't really know what to say," he began, his voice thick. Tears welled in his eyes. They told me what you did, how you ran to me, how you didn't stop. They told me about the attack. He choked on the word. You were saving my life, and that monster, he... Sully couldn't finish. He just wept, his broad shoulders shaking. Sarah, her own eyes filling with tears, squeezed his hand. I'm just glad you're okay, Sully, she whispered. My wife wants to meet you. My kids, they've been drawing you pictures. They call you their dad's guardian angel, he said, finally composing himself. I saw some of the garbage on the news online. Don't you listen to any of it, you hear me? Not a word. You're a hero. The guys at the station, we all know it. You're family now. His gratitude was a shield. His words were a balm on the wounds the trolls had inflicted. He became her most vocal defender, doing interviews from his hospital bed, his voice booming with conviction as he told every reporter who would listen that he was only alive because of Sarah Jenkins. The fire department made it official. The captain of Sully's station, a grizzled veteran named Chief Brody, came to visit. He brought a custom-made plaque and an official helmet from their station with Jenkins stenciled across the back. You're one of us now, he said, his voice gruff but his eyes kind. Anyone who runs toward danger to save one of my men is family. Simple as that. The firefighters from Station 12 became a regular presence. They brought her bad hospital coffee, gossiped about station politics, and argued about football at her bedside. They were loud, boisterous, and wonderfully normal. They treated her not as a fragile victim or a controversial figure, but as a colleague, a friend. Meanwhile, the wheels of justice ground slowly and painfully forward. The preliminary hearing for Trevor Abernathy was a new kind of hell. Sarah had to give a deposition from her hospital bed, a lawyer and a court stenographer crowding her small room. Trevor's public defender was a sharp, ambitious man named Mr. Davies, who employed a strategy of throwing mud in the hopes that some of it would stick. He questioned her memory, her motivations, even her professional competence, trying to build a narrative that Trevor had felt threatened by her aggressive approach to the scene. The entire process was designed to make her feel small, to make her question herself, and it was excruciatingly effective. After 3 long, agonizing weeks, Sarah was finally discharged. Going home was a terrifying victory. Her small, cozy house, once her sanctuary, now felt alien. Every shadow was a potential threat, every sudden noise a jolt to her frayed nerves. Jesse stayed with her, sleeping on the couch, a constant, reassuring presence. But the nights were the worst. The nightmares were relentless, replaying the attack in vivid, horrifying detail. She would wake up gasping, the phantom pain of the knife in her back as real as the sweat soaking her sheets. The morning after her first night home, she was awoken by a strange sound. It wasn't a loud noise, but a low, pervasive rumble, a vibration she felt in the floorboards. Jessie was already at the window, her hand covering her mouth. "Dra," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. You have to see this." Leaning heavily on her cane, her body aching with every step, Sarah made her way to the front door. She pulled it open, squinting in the bright morning light. And the world fell away. Her street, her quiet, tree-lined suburban street, was gone. In its place was a sea of blue, dress blues, standing in silent, perfect formation, stretching from the intersection at one end of the block to the cul-de-sac at the other, were over 200 United States Marines. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their backs ramrod straight, their white hats a stark, uniform line against the green lawns. They were utterly still, their silence more powerful than any shout. At the foot of her driveway, at the head of this incredible formation, stood her father. He was in his own dress blues, a uniform he hadn't worn in 20 years. The fabric was stretched tight across his proud chest, his old medals gleaming in the sun. He met her eyes, and for the first time since the attack, she saw the mask of the stoic gunny sergeant fall away. In its place was just a father, his eyes shining with a fierce, profound pride and love. He hadn't told her. He had simply made a call to his old unit. That call had sparked a chain reaction, a message passed from veteran to veteran across the state and beyond. The daughter of one of our own is a hero. She's been hurt. She's home, and she needs to know she's not alone. And they had come. They had driven through the night, taken time off work, left their families, all to stand guard for the daughter of a brother Marine. A sob caught in Sarah's throat, a raw, powerful emotion that was equal parts shock, gratitude, and overwhelming relief. The weight of the past few weeks, the pain, the fear, the doubt, the hateful words of strangers, seemed to lift from her shoulders, blown away by this silent, breathtaking tribute. She leaned against the doorframe, tears streaming down her face, and just let it wash over her. It was a silent, powerful rebuke to every troll, every cynic, every person who had dared to question her courage. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The media arrived, of course. News vans clogged the entrance to her street, but they couldn't get close. The Marines formed an impenetrable, silent perimeter. Brenda Vance, her microphone in hand, could only shout questions from a block away, her sensationalism rendered impotent by the quiet dignity of the scene. The story that day wasn't about the attack or the controversy. It was about honor, respect, and a brotherhood that spanned generations. It was a message to the world and to Sarah. You are protected, you are honored, you are one of us. The silent vigil of the Marines was the pivot point. It didn't magically heal her wounds or erase the trauma, but it shifted the ground beneath her feet. It was a profound and public declaration that her actions were not just justified, but honored at the deepest level by a community that understood sacrifice better than any other. It gave her back a piece of the strength she thought she had lost forever. The weeks that followed were a grueling march toward recovery. Physical therapy was a brutal daily battle. Her therapist, a relentlessly cheerful woman named Maria, pushed her relentlessly. There were days when the pain in her shoulder and back was so intense that every small movement was agony. Days she wanted to quit, to just curl up and let the world fade away. But then she would remember the sight of those 200 Marines, the unwavering belief in Sully's eyes, the fierce loyalty of her sister, and she would push through one more repetition, one more painful stretch. She started attending a support group for victims of violent crime. Sitting in a circle of strangers in a sterile community center room, she listened to their stories and, for the first time, shared her own. She spoke of the nightmares, the anxiety that made a trip to the grocery store feel like a combat mission, the lingering anger and fear. In the shared vulnerability of that room, she found a different kind of strength, the knowledge that she was not alone in her invisible wounds. The foundation was Jesse's idea first. All that GoFundMe money, she'd said one evening, scrolling through the staggering total on her laptop. Your medical bills are covered, your lost wages are covered. There's still so much left. We could do something with it, something real. They brainstormed with Sully, who was now out of the hospital and mobile on crutches. He was on fire with the idea. People freeze, he'd said, his voice passionate. In an emergency, good people stand there and do nothing because they're scared or they don't know how. You didn't freeze, Sarah. We should teach people not to freeze. And so the Second Chance First Response Foundation was born. They used the excess funds to create a nonprofit dedicated to providing free certified CPR and first aid training to the public. Their motto was simple: the first responder is the person standing next to you. They designed compact, comprehensive trauma kits, modeled on Sarah's own "oh crap" bag, and distributed them at their training sessions. Their first class was held in the community hall of Station 12. 30 ordinary people showed up on a Saturday morning. Teachers, accountants, stay-at-home parents, teenagers. Sarah, her arm still in a sling but her voice clear and strong, stood before them and told her story. She didn't just teach them how to apply a tourniquet or perform chest compressions. She taught them the most important lesson she had learned: that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. The foundation grew. Their story was a powerful catalyst, and soon they had a waiting list for classes. Other fire stations offered their facilities. Paramedics and off-duty nurses volunteered to teach. It was becoming a movement. A few months later, a producer from TED saw a news clip about the foundation. They invited Sarah to speak at their national conference. The thought was terrifying, but it was an opportunity she couldn't refuse. Standing on that iconic red circle under the bright, unforgiving lights, she felt a tremor of fear. But then she looked out at the sea of faces and began to speak. She didn't use notes. She just spoke from the heart. There are moments that cleave your life in two, she began. Before and after. For me, that moment came at dawn in front of a burning house. But I'm not here to talk about the attack. I'm here to talk about the choice that preceded it. A choice that every single one of us faces in ways large and small, every single day. It's the choice to step forward when every instinct is screaming to step back. It's the choice to get involved. She spoke about the bystander effect, but she also spoke about what she called the helper effect, the profound world-altering power of a single person deciding that the well-being of a stranger matters. She ended her speech with a simple, powerful call to action. You don't have to be a nurse or a firefighter or a Marine to save a life, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. You just have to be a human being who is willing to care. The power to be a hero is already inside you. You just have to choose to use it. The standing ovation was deafening. Her talk went on to become one of the most viewed of the year. The final piece of her journey fell into place in a quiet, sterile courtroom. Trevor Abernathy, looking smaller and more pathetic than she remembered, was found guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison. There was no joy in the verdict for Sarah, only a quiet, somber sense of closure. Justice had been served. A chapter had been closed. A year to the day after the attack, Sarah and Jesse finally made it to the mountains. They pitched their tent by a clear, cold lake, the scent of pine and damp earth a healing balm. That night, sitting by the fire, they finally used the ridiculously long marshmallow skewers. Jessie looked at her sister, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. You know, she said softly, it's weird. In a way, that horrible day gave you your voice. Sarah looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky, a perfect marshmallow, toasted to a golden brown with no hint of Sir Reginald's past catastrophic immolations, in her hand. A faint, silvery scar peeked out from the collar of her flannel shirt. It no longer ached. It was just a part of her now, a map of where she had been. She wasn't the same woman who had driven this road a year ago, dreaming of a simple escape. The world had broken her, but in doing so, it had broken her open. She had lost her naivete but found her purpose. She had faced the worst of humanity and been lifted by the best of it. The rage and the fear had finally given way to a quiet, resilient peace. Yeah, Sarah said, a small, genuine smile on her face as she looked into the flames. It is weird. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely, unshakably free.